Today we have a guest, Sushant Hede, with us, and we are going to discuss Household Consumption Expenditure Survey, which was released last week. So the old viewers and listeners, they might know Sushant because we had done an episode for my Marathi podcast. But for new viewers, I'll just request him to introduce himself.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Swapnil, for allowing me to be part of your podcast once again. It's absolute pleasure to be here again. So briefly introducing myself, my name is Sushant Hede. I am a recent graduate from Rutgers University, finished my master's there. Also a chartered accountant and have been working as an economist previously at Care Ratings, but currently I am, you can call me a Berozgar economist.
Shikshit
That's
Berozgar.
how I can introduce Shikshit Berozgar is how you can introduce myself. But yeah, this is how I would like to introduce, and that's how we can start the discussion.
Yes.
Hit that like button, share this episode with your friends and colleagues, and subscribe to my channel.
So, just tell us, like, what exactly is a household consumption survey, and why is it important for every Indian to understand?
Got it. So let's think of it this way: like we usually are interested more on GDP, inflation. These are the macro numbers which we all like to look at. But this is a survey which tries to understand the consumption and the expenditure patterns of Indians.
Hmm,
Okay, so that is how much are we spending, say, on food? How much are within food also? How much are we spending on cereals, on
hmm,
fruits, on vegetables? How much are we spending on the non-food components, say on durable goods, on health, on education? So these, if we want to understand this micro setup, like how,
hmm.
on which aspects are we spending, and that helps you in understanding what is the standard of living of Indians and how that standard of living of Indians has improved over time. So that is the key part which this survey helps you to understand. So
Okay,
now why
great.
this survey is important is because, as I said, it tells you about the standard of living of people. And little bit more on the details, this survey is very important because this survey has come out after like 11 years. The
Hmm,
last survey which was conducted was in 2011-12, and this is like now 11-12 years after which this survey has come out. And you are reaching to almost like 2.5 lakh households across India. So that's like a comprehensive study. So like even if you take 4 people per household, that's like 10 lakh people have been reached out to get this survey done. So you get a lot of details of how people are spending in India, and that's why this is important. Little more on the details about why it is important. Come up we can discuss that as this podcast goes ahead.
has the standard of living increased, and by how much? And is the scenario in urban area better than the, say, rural area, or vice versa? So, what this particular survey tells us?
Okay, so broadly, if you're looking at the numbers, usually the important number which is looked at here is the average monthly per capita expenditure. So
Hmm,
that is what is called as MPCE. That's the number which we usually have to look at when we are looking at this survey. I have a small table. So this is how this data which is collected, which gives you a broad overview of how the spending has changed over time, as well as, so now if you see, this is what I was talking about, the average monthly per capita expenditure for the rural. So like an average, now this is also very important to understand, we are talking of an average person, which can be skewed because of certain outliers.
got it.
So the rural spending on the average monthly per capita expenditure is 3,773, and on the urban side, it's roughly around 6,500. So this is the number
Yeah.
which I'm talking about. This is how much monthly people are spending on the rural side and how
Hmm,
much people are spending on the urban side. And if you look at the trend over time, this is how much so people were spending around 486 rupees monthly in 2000, and that has gone up to 3773 in 23. Again, these are numbers for an average person, and also what we popularly call is in nominal terms or in current prices. That's also important to understand. So this is how much they're spending based on the prices as of day, or as of when the survey was conducted, which was in 22-23. So that is roughly around 3773. If you look at the growth, now this is compounded average growth which I have taken. So that is gone down. So if you see, on an average, we were spending, the growth was 16.5% in the previous survey. That has gone down a little bit, and it's growing at 10% roughly in 23. On the urban side, if you see, and again you see a dip here, whereas the growth rate has moderated from 15% to 8.5%. So that's where you see that the growth is now moderating to some extent, but in nominal terms, yes, we are growing in terms of monthly per capita expenditure.
Just by looking at the numbers, the growth rate at least, so we can see that rural has been growing faster in general. Like after like 2010, we can see that rural has been growing faster than urban. Plus the difference that you have shown in the row 17, that has also narrowed. So what can we deduct from this particular point? Is the gap between rural and urban incomes have narrowed?
Yeah, so if you look at the difference between rural and urban, that's what I have tried to compute in the row number 17, where you see that what is the difference, that is a part of the numerator, and I have calculated that as a percentage of rural consumption itself. Okay, so we clearly see that from 11-12 to 23, yes, from 84%, it has, that wage difference has gone, has come down to 71%. So that is, sorry, not the wage, the consumption differential between the rural and the urban side has moderated, and that's pretty good sign. And you can attribute different reasons for that. Like we have seen from 2014-15 onwards, there has been a lot of push given to rural sector development, in terms of a lot of rural connectivity has improved in terms of infrastructure. There's a lot of digital push which has also reached out to the rural side. So that has really helped improve the standard of living of people there. And that's what the consumption expenditure differential is, what is getting reflected in the numbers as well. So also a lot of the push was also given in terms of subsidies as well as DBT transfer, direct benefit transfers to of rural people. So that gets reflected in all these numbers, and that's a positive sign if you look at the aggregate numbers.
Got it, got it. But in 22-23 data, how much COVID might have impacted? We have seen that there has been increase in subsidies in terms of free food grains. So how much that has impacted in this consumption expenditure? As in, I know there are no data as such, but what's the guesstimate about this particular thing?
Yeah, I think that will be better reflected when we get unit level data. See, I can think of it in two terms here. One is in terms of the consumption expenditure going higher. So that is a positive sign. But when you're looking at it only at the aggregate number, we must try to drill down whether we have better, as you said, guesstimates, or whether we get certain interpretations out of it. So if you look at post-COVID period where we got a lot of subsidies and all, I'm not really sure whether that may have really helped, because if you see the agriculture GVA, the performance of agriculture GVA as such, that has been around 3 to 4%, but there have been historically periods where it was 5-6% as well. So agriculture in generally has been a very volatile component in the economy. So whether post-COVID, where we see that, okay, agriculture is doing really well, 3% more, except for the current last quarter probably. But when we say agriculture is doing well, that would have led to higher rural spending. Not sure whether COVID would have been a critical factor, because yes, there have been years where agriculture did do really well. Secondly, in terms of poverty, and I would like to show another data point which I have. Now, we don't have a very recent poverty line as such, because the
Yeah.
last poverty line which was computed was in 11-12, which was the Tendulkar committee, and then there was the Rangarajan committee in 2014. Tendulkar committee, which was there in 2011-12, if you see, this is the poverty, the level of poverty in India, that is 25% in the rural sector are fall under the extreme poverty segment.
Okay.
So,
Again, the
I'll just
poverty lines are also based on the consumption expenditure only.
consumption
There is
expenditure.
no income related data in India.
No, so this
Yeah.
number again, 816 rupees. It was the monthly per capita expenditure in the rural side, and on the urban it's 1,000 rupees.
1,000.
So based on these consumption expenditure estimates, we clearly see that in 11-12 it was 25% were poor, and in the urban side it is around 13% which is poor. The current numbers, which again I have taken from State Bank of India report, which was released yesterday, where they have again come up with an estimation where they said around 7.2% in the rural side and 4.6%. So now 7% of the population. So that's a significant improvement.
Yeah.
Both on the rural side and on the urban side as well. Now, again, there are a lot of counter arguments to this, where you can say, are the two surveys which was done in 11-12 and 22-23, are they comparable? Okay,
Okay.
that's the biggest question which is asked now, and we still don't have the unit level data to estimate these poverty numbers. Also, we do not have a poverty line, so there are a lot of questions. So we cannot like blindly say, okay, yes, poverty has reduced significantly, but yes, there has been improvement. From 25% we have definitely come down, but whether we have come down to 5 to 7%, that is the question which needs to be asked.
But in general, we have the evidence that poverty has declined. So how much is something which we will know only when we get more data. So right now, the government has not released any data, the underlying data, basically.
Yes.
Right? They have
Yes,
just
yes,
released
yes.
a fact sheet, basically, which says that, okay, this is how the broader trends look like. Maybe in future, in some months, they might be releasing the detailed data. The numbers that you have quoted earlier for the urban and rural, they are nominal numbers, which is basically not adjusted for inflation. After adjusting for inflation, the numbers obviously will be lower. Right now, they are 9% or 8%. They are lower to like 3% or 4%. Then what is the implication of that?
So first, to give the numbers, in both sides we are growing at around 3%, 3.2 and 2.8 to be specific. But the important question is, why is the per capita expenditure lagging income, is something we can ask as a question. Because if you see the per capita GDP number, that has grown by around 4% at a CAGR level. That is from 11-12 to 23. If you look at the average growth, that has been around 4%. Okay. And whereas if you look at this number, then it's at around 3%, rural and urban level. So why is consumption slowing down? Because at the same time, if you look at the savings data which RBI usually releases, savings in India is also going down.
Okay, right.
So there's something which is not adding up. If you see, the income is growing, but the consumption is slowing down, but even savings are slowing down. So is it the question that where in the income side, which part is growing faster? Is it from the rural side? Because we also have anecdotal evidences that real wages are stagnating, right? So then where is it growing? So these are kind of questions which I feel this data is throwing out when you look at the income, consumption and savings setup as such.
Yeah, actually, those are very really good questions, and I think it needs like one needs to think about all these things. Only thing is that we cannot analyze any further because of lack of data.
Right,
Uh,
right,
so now let's go one layer down from urban and rural. Let us talk about food and non-food, as in expenditure on food. Its share has decreased over time.
right. So I'll again share my screen specifically for that data. We are looking at the household consumption survey. Now, this is the only part which is important. And if you
Hmm.
see that the share of food and beverages has gone down from 53% to 46% in the rural side, and on the urban side it has gone down from 42 to 39, right? And similarly
Hmm.
non-food has increased. That's like pretty obvious. So if you see cereals, which
Hmm.
again is one area where there are a lot of controversies which are going on
Yeah.
in terms of the farmers side, which probably can deal with later. But if you see cereals, spending of people has gone down, and that is considerable fall in consumption expenditure of cereals.
Hmm.
And now, the obvious question is, if cereals have gone down, where is the average Indian spending the money on?
Hmm.
So, if you see the answer could be because now we are as an country becoming more health aware, health conscious. Are we spending more on proteins? Are we spending more
Hmm.
on milk, eggs? Is that how our composition changing? Are we spending more on fruits? So if you look at the granular level data, you see, yes, fruits has gone up. So yes, that is a positive.
Hmm.
Vegetables has gone down. Okay,
Okay.
but there are segments in the protein side where you see meat, fish, eggs that has gone up. Not that much, but yes, the spending has increased within the protein segments as
Got it.
such. But if you
Hmm.
see vegetables, that has gone down. Or pulses, again, you can see that as proteins for the vegetarians, that has gone down from 2.7 to
Okay.
1.7 in the rural, and 1.9 to 1.2 in the urban. Now, the biggest thing which was I was quite surprised is to see the increase in the share of prepared meals or snacks. Okay, that has gone up
Hmm.
in both the rural and the urban sector. So, and that is from 7.9 to 9.6. That's
Hmm.
a considerable increase. In the urban side, if you look at the top items where people are spending, this segment of prepared meals that has the highest weight, 10%. 10% of
Yeah.
the money which we
So
are
basically,
spending.
if person is is spending 100 rupees in total, 10 rupees
Yes,
is on basically the
is
packaged food.
packaged food. Now,
Hmm.
that shows that are we really moving? Are we health aware? Are we health conscious? I'm not really sure.
Okay.
So that is again, that
Hmm.
was probably the most surprising thing. The non-food side of it is even interesting. Okay. Now again, if you see part tobacco, that has gone up. Now there are so many. When you go and watch movies, that's something which gets shown displayed right before the movie starts. But then there's so much awareness. But again, a person is spending both in the rural and in the urban
Hmm.
side.
This also
Uh,
shows something like just on a different note. Recently, a lot of movie stars are endorsing pan masala, so maybe that can,
that
maybe
kind of
having an impact.
the marketing strategy of companies are doing well. That's what you
Yeah,
can.
yeah,
And also the stock market, there's one company which is doing really well because of
yeah.
it. So this is on the lighter side, but yeah, and people are spending on health. Now, if you see rural side, people are spending 7 rupees out of 100 rupees on health, which is again a
Hmm.
sizable part of their expenditure. Again, important thing to note, 22-23 was the year where it was immediately after like the 2 years of COVID, where we remember there was a phenomena of revenge spending. People are spending a
Hmm.
lot on
Yeah.
stuff. People are traveling a lot. So that's what gets reflected in this year's number. And you see durable goods that has gone up from 4.8 to 6.9 and 5.6 to 7% in the urban. So you see that there's a significant jump in durable goods. Or for example, conveyance, which is below, you see there's a
Right.
significant jump here. Whether to take 22-23 as the year, as a base year, again is a question mark. And that's why there is another survey or the data which is going to come up, which is on 23-24. So that's
Okay.
what the MOSPI decided, whether 22-23 can it be considered as a base year. So again, we should look at the data which comes up in the next survey to get more clarity. Another thing which is surprising is this education. And I don't have an answer to this. Why is it going down? Fees are going up. Education inflation was averaging 6% from 11-12 to like before COVID. So it was only after the COVID phenomena where yes, that inflation number did go down 1-2%. But again, why that share enrollment in schools are increasing, more students taking up higher education? Could it be because the composition of households which have been surveyed that is different now? So, for example, if I look at my house currently, we are four individuals, and we are not spending on education at all at the moment.
Right.
So if there are more types of my type of people in the survey, you might have lower spending. So again, these are average numbers. You can't really say that okay, it's gone down, but because of a specific reason.
Is it because birth rates have gone down, or population below 15 or below 18 is now lower than the last decade? Is that something happening?
Could be possible. That's what it depends on the composition of that household, whether there are kids or teens in the composition. That could be a material factor in this spending.
Okay.
Because
Okay.
I don't see any specific reason why spending on education should go down.
In the same table, you have put the CPI weightages. To give an introduction, I think the 11-12 household consumer survey, those weightages were given to the CPI of 11-12, right?
Yes.
If this or maybe next survey, those weightages can be given to the next CPI, if at all we get a
Yes.
next CPI next year or probably after 2 years. So what is the relationship between the CPI, the inflation, and the expenditure basket?
Right. So you absolutely nailed it by saying that the survey weights do get reflected in the CPI while calculating the inflation, which is the consumer price inflation, which is what, or we say popularly, the retail inflation side. So that's where they get captured. Broadly, if you see food share, so I have this table here, which is more simple to understand. So this is on the rural side and this is urban. I've just taken the weights which was given to CPI of during 11-12, and this is the current survey weights which you can see. So if you see, food as such has gone down from 54 to 46. Fuel also has gone down, and core, which is all items excluding food and fuel, has gone up. Now, if you are using these weights will then be used in constructing retail inflation. Again, I don't want to go into the technicalities of how that is done, but the broad consensus is that, okay, because the share of food has gone down, retail inflation would come down. Okay, that's a natural thing because the weight has gone down, food inflation. But again, if food inflation is high, that time, if you see, yes, I can understand food retail inflation will come down. But what if the case is that other products, their inflation is high? And in that case, if those products, say for example, the inflation of education and health is high, okay, and if the weights have gone up, then in that case, overall retail inflation can also go up. Just to summarize, I don't think we can very clearly say that just because the share of food has gone down, retail inflation will be lower going ahead, because we need to look at the components, and that's how we analyze. Building on analysis will be more prudent.
And apart from inflation, what kind of policies government design based on this particular survey?
So, from a policy perspective, as I think we have briefly talked about it as well, it's in terms of, say, poverty. We discussed that, or so this survey tells us about the poverty estimates. Obviously, we need to have a poverty line. Also, in terms of inequality in the country. Based on these numbers, then we can develop policies on which segment are we supposed to focus on, right? So if, say, for example, poverty has reduced significantly, something which we derive. So recently the government announced that the free food scheme is now extended for 5 more years. So we know that we are spending around 2 lakh crores on the food subsidy. So can that amount be reduced and be used for other areas, say other rural development or urban development? So this is one implication which I can think of immediately. Another important thing is the amount of subsidy, is whether it is reaching the lowest strata or the bottom 10 or 20% of the poor. So if you look at data, and I'll share that data. So if you look at, so this is like the classification of the income, which so sorry, not the income, the consumption expenditure. So this is like the bottom half of the pyramid, 0 to 30%, and then you have the top half of the pyramid. So if you see in the rural side, and what is this amount? It's the amount which the government, which has given the freebies or the subsidy to the people, how much amount of that is being spent by or how much is the, so in their consumption basket, how much is the freebies. So if you see, it's only 68 rupees, so which is quite low than probably the one in the top 20 percentile of the pyramid. So that's kind of concerning, because if you see the urban side, you see a higher share and for the bottom half, and that keeps on going down, which is ideally that's how it has to be. But it's something, somewhere it's not reaching the rural side, the top 10% percentile. So that's something concerning, and policy framework in this direction can do wonders.
Does that mean that the one, either we are not identifying who are needy in terms of this kind of subsidies? Second, actual transfer or the implementation issue, both can get highlighted from this particular result, right? In urban areas, everything looks better in terms of the identification is also better,
Yes,
and the implementation of or the transfers are also better.
Exactly. So that's a good takeaway from this result, especially from a policy perspective.
One thing is that we have, if like made the transfer, the direct benefit transfer, the DBT, this particular scheme is now very efficient because there are bank transfers, the Aadhaar is linked and everything is linked. But there is some issue with the rural data, right?
I'm not sure whether that issue will be with the rural data. I'm not saying that it's not reaching them. It's that lower amount is reaching them, or we are not identifying those set of people which you mentioned.
The survey has been conducted after the COVID. Is something related to COVID still, factoring this? Because one, in COVID, what we saw was the reverse migration from urban areas to rural areas. Second, we saw that the agriculture was the only sector performing good, at least in the initial days of COVID. And third, we saw that there was a higher subsidy. All these three combined, like, can we connect some dots over here?
I'm not really sure whether we can connect those dots, because again, we need to look at, say, unit level data. Because obviously the government has been very confidently saying that, okay, the identification is done, the transfers are being done, and they are reaching the poor. Whether it's reaching them and spending that amount, that is something it's not very clear whether that is actually happening or not at the ground level. And that's where Yes, we need to work on that front.
There is another thing that I was reading. Basically, it was about one of the controversial things that are happening, and we kind of discussed earlier, that the cereals proportion has gone down. Does that mean then
Yes,
the fight for MSP, or you know the overall agricultural reforms are, one, they are now due. We can clearly see that. Second is that market, the beauty of market, the beauty of free markets is something which everyone underappreciates in the long run, which is that the different activities, different categories of food, let's say fish, poultry, or eggs and milk, all those things, there is lesser government regulation, right? But its proportion has been increasing
right,
steadily.
right.
Consumers have been spending a lot on these. The GVA, which is the gross value added in the GDP, in the national
Mm,
income, that is also been
yes,
increasing a lot. That compared to the crops,
yes,
which is basically more government
yes,
controlled. The outputs are controlled, the inputs are controlled, everything is almost controlled. With regard to, say, MSP is there, then there are
yes,
different kinds of subsidies given to farmers to produce some kind of crop. Plus there is the procurement also from the government, which is basically the FCI
right,
buys
right,
goods, buys crops like rice and wheat from the farmers, and they give MSP. At least they try
right,
to give MSP. Not all the time they succeeded, but they try to give MSP. So,
right,
but the market is showing
right,
us different results, that okay, the consumers don't want rice and wheat any longer, at least not in that quantity which is getting produced, which is getting marketed. But people are turning to more vegetables, turning to more milk and milk products or pulses and all those
yes,
things. At least
yes,
this was the idea, this was the thing that everyone was highlighting whenever the new GDP
right,
data comes out. Obviously, in the consumer
yes,
consumption survey, we are not able to find out, like, the protein intake is not getting much share, but at least in terms of the aggregate macro level data, we are seeing that the crops GVA, it has been increasing at
yes.
a diminishing rate, but the
Mhm.
fish and
Dimension,
other
right,
rates are growing higher. So what can we conclude from
right.
this particular thing?
Yeah, so I think you quite well summarized the entire thing, that the support which the government gives, that is more on the cereals, rice, wheat, and the core cereals, the pulses, oilseed. These are the segments where you get a lot of support. Again, the most important one is the rice and wheat, but but if you look at their production growth in the last 10, 11 years, that has been like 2% or something. It is part of a Niti Aayog paper which was covered in today's Times of India, and it's pretty interesting to see that the data here. It's clearly, you can see the growth rate in terms of production for rice, wheat, and core cereals, that has been around 1.5 to 2.5%. Whereas you see fruits or dairy products or fish, those are doing reasonably well in the last 10 years. And if you see the share in consumption, you see cereals, pulses going down, and you see fruits, dairy products, protein, milk, those going up. So, in terms of support, do we really need to give support to the commodity? Again, if you see, rice is a high water intensive commodity,
Hmm.
sugarcane, again, a high
Yeah.
water intensive commodity. So we are giving support to these, to the farmers, and even in dry places, dry states in the India where irrigation is a problem, there you have groundwater reservoirs which get used up to produce these commodities. But that's somewhere even the consumption is going down in these commodities. So do
Right.
we really need to give support to these commodities, as against if we make more awareness, if the government makes more awareness and supports horticulture, for example, and dairy products and livestock products, we can and give support to these commodities. then probably things can differ. So this is an important policy discussion which needs to happen, and more awareness needs to be created in this aspect. So this is very critical and a good result when you look at both consumption as well as the production side of it. So this is really interesting
Right.
result which we have got.
For this, I think even farmers need to be educated, or they should be informed that, okay, probably you don't need this kind of products, you can grow something different. Obviously the soil condition, weather conditions, all those things matter, but like if you can produce, say, fruit or a vegetable instead of say wheat or rice, then that will give farmers better income, higher yield, and also they have a good price also in the international market, so they can export, or like all those things can,
Right.
obviously it will take time, but
Exactly.
one,
One more important
yeah,
thing here is, see, this is, I understand this is kind of a very sensitive topic, and people are averse to change, right? So
yeah,
that's something
yeah,
which is very difficult to change the mindset of people who have, especially
yes,
the farmers who have been growing this over time. So
hmm.
that's absolutely a difficult thing to do, and a lot of political stuff gets involved into this. So again, it's a difficult ask to change the mindsets of people
Hmm.
first of all.
Maybe a better incentive structure needs to be designed, but again, one thing that is for sure, we don't want something like MSP, say for fish or something like that, that will distort the market and things will go haywire. We have to design some incentives in such a way where at least the market is not distorted in terms of, say, input prices and output prices, they don't get disturbed.
It's a difficult thing to manage. There are a lot of
Hmm.
trade-offs here, so having that balancing act gets difficult.
And is there any other policy implication or any other broad level thing that you can think of from this particular survey, which can help people, which can help policy makers and also businesses?
One is, it's not just the poverty which we look at, but also we look at inequality, for example. So there was
Hmm.
this SBI report which came up yesterday, and I found out that it was pretty interesting in terms of inequality. They do a lot of index calculation, which is a little bit on the technical side, but
Mm-hmm.
it is pretty evident if you just take this. If you do a simple calculation, you take the consumption spending of the top 10 percentage or the top 5% and the bottom 5%, and you take
Hmm.
the ratio of that. If you do that for 11, 12, and 23, that has gone down. Another way is you can calculate an index where you just try to see for the lowest percentile how much that spending, how far is it from the average spending. Okay,
Hmm.
and you can, if the more further it is, the more
Hmm. Hmm.
inequality is rising, right? So you can construct an index based on this value, and they did that construction, and you see that that ratio has gone down, or that index value has gone down, and that these are positive signs which we can see that both poverty and inequality have gone down. We saw the divergence between rural and urban consumption that has
Hmm.
also narrowed. So these are certain positive developments. On the contrary, if you see, I did one assessment, and I'll pull out the data for that as well. So these are two buckets. If you can see, this is one
Hmm.
side, and this other. So the one on the this has high rural population, more the states in India which have a higher rural population, and these states are the ones which have a lower rural population.
Sorry, just to clarify. So the left-hand side
Yeah, yeah,
table
yeah.
is basically where the rural population is lower. Let's say, for example, Delhi has the lowest rural population, which is 2%. And in the
Yes,
right-hand side table,
yes.
we can see that Himachal Pradesh has the highest rural population of 90%.
Exactly. So this is
Yeah.
the for the population. So like the all India average is like we have 69% in staying in the rural. That is the all India average. I
Hmm.
tried to divide it. The ones which are below that 69 falls in this bucket,
Okay.
and the ones which are above 69, they fall in this bucket. So this is like a simple.
Right. Got it.
Interestingly, the rural wage consumption gap, which we saw, which is again this column here and this column here, I found that for a more rural dominated states, the average gap is higher than the states which have lower rural dominated. The initial hypothesis or the conjecture which I had is that if there is more rural domination, the gap between the consumption spending in the rural and the urban side, that would be slightly narrower, is what I had made a conjecture.
Okay.
uh, Whereas the ones where it's slightly less, it's more urbanized, I thought that okay, there if it's more urbanized, then probably the gap between rural and urban is much, in spending terms, can be more. But here it was quite contradictory to my hypothesis, and I found out that the average spending across states
Hmm.
is much lower in a more urbanized setup than in a rural setup. So that is something we can think about again. So the last urbanization rate in India in 2011 was 32%, but India has developed, so there are chances that the urbanization in India would have also gone up, which is not
Hmm.
getting captured here.
Right.
So this is again lack of data, which where we can again need to come up with the survey on urbanization as well, because again, if the country has become more urbanized, but if our thought process is more rural dominated, more rural
Hmm.
focused, then there is a mismatch in thinking here. So there is one more thing which I had tried to do here. If
Hmm.
you look at, and I have data for 11 12 and 22 23, and you see that in the bottom 10 to 20% of the population, the gap between urban and rural, that has worsened or increased, if you see, from 34 to 45,
Right.
right?
Right.
Whereas the top percentile, that has improved. If you just look at it independently for this year, okay, for the top 5 percentile, it's really high. I completely agree. But if you look at that from the 11-12 survey, things
Hmm.
have improved
Okay.
pretty much in the
Hmm.
last 10 years. Whereas, so one conclusion which I can derive is the rural affluents
Hmm.
are actually doing well, if you see. Whereas
Okay.
if you see the urban poor, they are not doing, they are doing not that well. Whereas
Okay. Okay.
so this is kind of an important thing, that we all always say that the entire rural setup, if we look at real wages stagnating, we say okay, the entire rural side is a problem.
Hmm.
But here if you see that the bottom 50%, if you see this entire segment, there has been a sharp improvement.
Hmm.
So this is a different takeaway, that it's when you can't just associate entire rural setup to be doing bad. This data says that okay, it's the probably the rural affluents are doing pretty good.
Yeah. Yeah. So,
And that gap is happening in the bottom 10% of the population,
hmm.
which is this segment.
Yeah. And there has been a discussion on the urban employment as well, right? When we were going through pandemic, everyone was thinking that urban areas should also get Manrega type of program or scheme. This can be a one policy prescription out of this, like to generate more employment opportunities in urban areas in times of distress.
Yeah, you can think of it from that angle as well, and that's an interesting angle which you brought up.
What do you think are the most important aspects of this particular survey, and what is your final take on this?
So, like overall, if you see the scheme of things, standard of living of people have improved, but again, that
Hmm.
pace of growth in consumption spending has slowed down. So that is one important takeaway, that standard of living has improved. From that, we can conclude based on estimates that okay, poverty and inequality in the country has moderated. Again, we don't have the exact number, we need more data, we need poverty lines as well. But again, we can make certain estimations and do conclude to some extent that okay, poverty has or inequality has come down. Thirdly, we need to look at more data, which is the unit level data, which will, or the full report, which will be released soon. So that is something which is important to know. And the fourth important thing is the share of food has gone down. And but just saying that, okay, or concluding that, okay, the retail inflation will go down, that's something we shouldn't make a blind conclusion, because we need to look at the components and then take a call. And there are a lot of policy discussions which we had in terms of, say, MSPs, or in terms of inequality, poverty. So very timely. Again, it was a gap of 5 years, but
Yeah.
yes, sooner the better would have been the right approach. But again, we have the data now. We need to structure the policy accordingly.
One more thing which can hamper the next year's data, which is the current consumption slowdown that we are witnessing, right? So in the next year's data, we might see something
Yes,
different altogether, because consumption has kind of
exactly.
gone down. Yeah.
Yeah, just like you mentioned, the structure of the survey has also changed. Now, previously there used to be only one questionnaire. Now there have been three questionnaires on different products. And as you mentioned that, okay, next year the structure may be completely different. In 23, re-emerging from COVID, so again a different structure. In 17, it would have been a different structure.
Yeah.
Broadly, it depends on the timeline. Yes, yes.
Mm. So ideally, we should conduct these kinds of surveys every year, if possible, to actually get an idea like how the country is progressing. So hope for the best, and let's see. We will come again
Yes.
whenever the detailed data comes out. We will again analyze this. Okay. Thank you
Yes,
once
yes,
again, Sushant,
definitely.
for
Yes.
this
Yes,
beautiful,
thank you so much.
amazing
Yes,
interview. Yeah.
yes, thank you. Thank you so much for your time.